In 1881, a remarkable story unfolded in the city of Luxor in Egypt. Local authorities became aware of a tomb. The tomb had been discovered as early as 1860 and had been used by a local family as a sort of treasure trove. They would enter the tomb to remove valuable items on occasion and then sell them on the local antiquities market. As these items began to proliferate, local scholars and government officials became convinced that a major discovery had taken place. This prompted an excavation. On July 6, 1881, two Egyptologists named Ahmed Kamal and Emil Bruch led a work team to the valley of Deir el-Bahari. Here, in the hills and cliffs not far from the temple of Hatshepsut, the Egyptologists were guided to a deep shaft. The hole opened up in the cliff face and descended down into darkness. It was approximately 12 meters or 40 feet deep, and could only be traversed by a long length of rope. As the scholars lowered themselves down, the outside world and modernity seemed to vanish above, and they came into a world of darkness. The Egyptologists reached the bottom of the shaft and took a moment to light flaming torches to guide their way into the black. As they entered, the light flickering before them, Kamal and Bruch were greeted by a ghostly sight. Coffins, dozens and dozens of coffins. They lay along the corridors and within chambers, filling up the sepulchre, their eyes glinting in the light. The Egyptologists had been led to a cache, a storage deposit in which the coffins and mummies of famous rulers had been removed from their sepulchres in the Valley of the Kings and redeposited in a specially organized burial. This burial had taken place around 1100 BCE, give or take, in an age where weakening government authority and lapsed security within the royal valleys had led to a spate of tomb robberies. Hoping to preserve the mummies of famous and powerful ancestors, the local priests and government officials had organized the reburial of many ancient pharaohs. Fortunately, the priests had labeled these coffins with the identities of their owners, and as Kamal and Bruch studied these caskets, they were greeted with the names of truly famous figures. Seqenenre-Ptah, who had led rebellion against the Hyksos rulers, King Amunhotep I and Queen Ahmose-Nefertari, both of whom had been revered as deities in the ancient village of Deir el-Medina, not far from this hidden tomb. They found coffins containing the mummies of kings Thutmose I, II, and III, and, perhaps most famously, coffins that held the bodies of King Ramesses II and his father, Sety I. Most of these mummies lay within caskets that did not originally belong to them. Thanks to the robberies, most of the golden treasure had long ago been looted and melted down. So when the priests removed these bodies from their original tombs, they had to find new burial containers. And the priests were not shy about a little bit of recycling. The mummies of Sety and Ramesses, for example, both lay within plain wooden caskets, a far cry from the fabulous gold and jewels we would expect for such wealthy rulers. What's more, the coffins themselves did not really belong to the age of Sety and Ramesses. The style of carving, the form of the bodies, and the decorative elements, those belonged to an earlier period, the 18th dynasty, decades, even a century or more before these kings had lived. In other words, the priests had turfed somebody else out of their own coffin in order to rebury these rulers. For all their fame and power, the bodies of these kings ultimately lay in funerary hand-me-downs. The reuse of coffins and the mixing up of caskets with different bodies is a noteworthy feature of the royal caches, and the wider historical period in which these events occurred. This coffin reuse is an interesting subject for study, and it's one that today's guest has devoted a great deal of time and energy. My guest today is Professor Cara Cooney. Kara, also known as Kathleen, is Professor of Egyptian Art and Architecture at the University of California, Los Angeles, or UCLA. Professor Cooney has undertaken a wide range of research, particularly in the New Kingdom period. In her academic career, she has published extensively on coffins and the reuse of burial goods during this historical period. To the wider public, Kara Cooney is best known as the author of histories like The Woman Who Would Be King, a biography of the female pharaoh Hatshepsut, and she has appeared prominently in many documentaries and series. Over the past few years, Professor Cooney had permission to study the coffins of the royal cache, which are now held in museums in Cairo. The first part of this research is now being published in a new book titled Recycling for Death: Coffin Reuse in Ancient Egypt and the Theban Royal Caches. The book is published by the American University in Cairo Press, and it is a lavish work. The book goes through all of the coffins contained within these burials, examining them in extreme detail for evidence of their reuse, questions of their original ownership, and how the ancients seem to have dealt with the problem. What do you do when somebody's coffin no longer suits them? Thanks to her research access in the Cairo museums, the book is richly illustrated with brand new photos of the coffins themselves. And for those who are interested in the history of Egyptology, the burial of the royal pharaohs, or simply the funerary aspects of ancient society, this book is probably going to become a standard reference work for many years ahead. For her second interview with the History of Egypt podcast, Professor Cooney sat down via Zoom to discuss the new book and the wider context of its subject matter. As you can see, it is a lengthy and detailed discussion, and we explore many questions about these ancient caskets. Please welcome Professor Kara Cooney. Good morning, Kara Cooney. Professor, how are you this morning?
I'm really good. Thank you so much for having me on, Dominic.
Welcome back, and it's a pleasure to talk to you again. You're currently speaking to us from Hawaii, is that correct?
I am. My husband grew up here. My husband Remy, many of you know him, and
Met him.
his mother is getting up there in years, and we come to visit whenever we can. So I'm in a house where they call it the new stove, and the stove was replaced, I think, in like 1982, and everything else is circa 1957, and it's pretty old school and really lovely. Yeah, it's great.
Excellent. So we are here to speak about an ongoing aspect of your academic research, which is coffins.
Yeah.
And you are currently in the final stages of preparing to publish a new book about coffins, and we'll get into that in a lot more detail as we go. But the new book, right out the gate, the new book is called Recycling for Death: Coffin Reuse in Ancient Egypt and the Theban Royal Caches. Your team sent me a copy of it, a digital copy, and I've been sort of reading through it. And it seems like it's kind of two books in one. Like the first book is very much a sequel to your earlier one, Cost of Death, which was a comprehensive study of the sort of economic aspects of coffin production around that in the New Kingdom. And then this one continues that, especially with the idea of reuse and everything that goes into it. But then the second half is a extended, very highly, thoroughly illustrated discussion of the royal caches, the burial caches that were mainly discovered in the late 1800s. So it's kind of two books in one. So just off the bat, walk us through how this particular project came together in the way that it has.
Okay, where do I start? So this project of coffin reuse started back in 2009 when I gave a paper for a Theban workshop organized by Betsy Bryan and Peter Dorman. And I started to look at the later, because I'd already done the Cost of Death. So I'm like, well, let me look at 21st dynasty coffins and late 20th to 21st and see how things changed. And the more I worked with that material, the more I realized that reuse was was very much a part of it. And it goes back even farther. When I was doing my dissertation research in the British Museum, I remember standing next to John Taylor in front of the coffin of Amunhotep, and you could clearly see, it's the most clear example of reuse there is, a 19th dynasty coffin decoration underneath the 20th dynasty coffin decoration of that lid. And I said, oh my goodness, it's reused. And John said, yeah, somebody should really work on that. And so here we are in 2024. And yeah, I've published a lot on coffin reuse in the meantime, but this is my first heavy monograph on coffin reuse. There is a small Cambridge element called Coffin Commerce, which has a lot of my ideas in it, but it's not the bread and butter, looking at all of the evidence visually of coffin reuse. That I saved for this. And so I've looked at coffins all around the world, in European museums and in Egypt, starting in Northern Europe and going to Paris and Berlin and London and here and there, in different collections who would have me take coffins out of storage or out of display if possible, open them up and let me look at them. Museums are all underfunded and increasingly underfunded as time goes on. It's not easy to get this kind of access. And where I got the best access was the last place really that I was visiting, and that's Cairo. And the Egyptian Museum Cairo at Tahrir took these pieces out, and if conservation allowed, opened each one up and allowed me to look at it from all angles, front, back, right, center, inside out. And thus it was these coffins that I decided to publish first. So it's a bit of a backwards journey. So I learned about coffin reuse, as one does. You're doing this research and you're learning about the research as you go, and you're refining and what you look for and how you look for it. And I had collected the most tricks and tips and hacks by the time I got to Cairo. So I was able to really use all the other coffins had taught me. And so I'm publishing those first. And also the way that Cairo Museum demands publication be done, I had to publish them first. They have to come out now. It really is a publisher perish with the way you get access to those pieces. You pay for the publication rights and you publish them. So the other coffins from Berlin, Paris, Austria, the United States, other places, those are all waiting in the wings to be published. And I do plan on doing a second volume, God's help me, of coffin reuse. And it will be a selection. It won't be this kind of book where I need to include all of the coffins that I can and that I had access to. It will be which coffins exemplify reuse the best, which ones show the reuse the best. But then I'll also include all of the statistics from the coffins that I visited, spreadsheet information, all of that data crunching. So there will be a second volume on the way, and I will co-publish that with Kylie Thompson, who laid out this book. She's currently a graduate student in her final year. She'll be a PhD by the time the second volume comes out. But the book that you have is a PDF and that will be out in paper form end of August of 2024 has something like 980 pictures. And, that it's just, it is a labor of love, and it's an exhausting layout process. It's exhausting to get all of your images lined up with the correct coffin. And it's a lot but there's no other way to show the reuse and to demonstrate it than to do that. So it was Cairo that gave me the best access. Cairo got the first publication, and there's a lot more coffins where that comes from. This work comes from, but this is where it started. Yeah.
Okay. And touching on that, there is one question that sort of comes to mind, which, I've never been beyond the public area of the Tahrir Museum, and I'm guessing 99.9% of our listeners haven't. Where do they keep the stuff that's not on display?
Yeah. Well, even the stuff that's on display, you can barely see, which seems very annoying to you, but for me, it's wonderful. So if you're up in the second floor and you're in the front gallery, though those cases where the coffins are, it's very hard to see the coffin, right? Some of them are very high up, and you can't really get there. There's no ladders available for the tourists to go by and look, and they're all closed, so you can't see inside of these pieces. Many of them in the Cairo Museum still contain bodies, as they
What?
should. That's what these coffins are for, right? So
Really?
it's a weird, yeah, exactly.
Wow.
It's a weird European thing to separate the body from the coffin, to put one in one museum and one in another, or to put one in storage and not show it, or to display it as the mummy, which we don't do as much anymore, but we certainly did. But so because they're displayed in that way, you just undo 4 screws, take off the panel, and then pull that coffin out, put it on a bench or on some other kind of conveyance that can allow me to get underneath it as well, if possible, or just onto the floor, maybe onto some pieces of foam, and then open that piece up and close it, so it allows the inaccessibility to the tourists as they are displayed, allows the person studying them, the researcher, extraordinary accessibility. The way that accessibility is doled out in the Cairo Museum is highly problematic. However, and I will honestly say that right now in the Cairo Museum, if somebody has dibs on a piece and they've signed up for any piece in the Cairo Museum, then no one else gets access to that piece for years. And I find that highly problematic. And I will say that there is no way with that system I could do this work now. I couldn't go in and say I need all of the coffins of the royal cache, because one coffin will be, under the name of this person, and another coffin will be under the name of that person, and I won't be able to get access to it. And in my opinion, museums are there to make coffins available, or objects available, to all researchers. But that's not the way they're doing it in the Cairo Museum right now. I've made those opinions of mine known, and here I am doing it on the podcast as well. But your question about those pieces that are not on display, some are in the basement, but very few of the pieces I worked on were in the basement. Actually, I don't think any of them. But the attic had many pieces in the attic. So if you're in that same gallery where all of the coffins are stored along the walls, and you look up, you can see that there's a loggia above the area that you're in. And you go up the steps, and you go into this attic, which is very poorly lit, incredibly dusty, with all that Cairo has to offer, right? Egypt is a dusty place right next to those deserts. And then you bring the petrochemicals in, and it doesn't help. And the coffins are in the same kinds of cases up there, or they're just lying out and covered. And so you find the coffin in the attic, which is really tricky with the light sources that you have. And then you pull that piece out, and we brought lights for this work, a couple of really small LED lights that we could plug in and use opportunistically. And thank God we did, because in the attic, the work wouldn't have happened without it. And then we ask a conservator to come in and please brush the coffin of dust if there's anything like that. And but working in the attic is tough. Like, really, the biggest concern I have is not to sweat on a coffin. So I put a cloth around my head, make sure that I'm not going to harm the object in any way, because they're very, very difficult working conditions. And just so that everyone, and I talk about this in the introduction, but just so everyone knows what this kind of work is like, I will get probably 3 to 4 hours with a given coffin at most, sometimes less, sometimes more. But it's a team effort, and I need to make sure that coffin is documented inside and out very quickly, and I need to put my eyes on that piece in as many different places as I can, and do my own note taking as quickly and efficiently as I can. So I came in with my iPad set up with a note template that I would then draw with my finger on the iPad. Okay, make sure you look at this, look at this, look at this, look at that. And I would go down my list of what I needed to make sure I took into account with each viewing of a coffin, and work through it as systematically as I could from that perspective. And sometimes, you'll miss something, or you don't get access to it. Or if it's a big outer coffin, you can't get the full separation in space to get the shot you need, or whatever it is. And and we just had to work through that. So the reader will notice that sometimes the Deir black and white is used for the establishing shot, particularly of larger pieces, because we in those spaces, those tight spaces, because they would take the coffin out, put it right on the ground where it was, right in front. Or if it's in the attic, you work with it there, and you have a couple feet around the piece, and that's it. And if that, and you just, we had to work opportunistically with whatever conditions were thrown at us. And the biggest commodity in museum research is time, because people they don't have all day to open up the coffin. They don't have all day to sit there and wait for you. They have emails to do as well. And you're taking them away from their regular work and making them sit with you in the gallery while you do this research. So the time, you got to be bisura. You got to be as fast as you can to get through those pieces.
Okay. So I'll ask one logistical question about that, because you did touch on sort of the difficulty of extracting them from their case and laying them out and photographing them. So the book is being published, this year, but many of the coffins that you're discussing have now been moved to the Nemec. So when did most of this photography and close study actually take place?
Yeah, the photography started in 2016, and I had a season of about just a month in 2016. And then I came back in 2018. So I started with all of the third intermediate period coffins in 2016. And then I actually had still on my permission the royal coffins, which I hadn't expected to publish. I'm a 20th and 21st dynasty scholar, right? 19th, 20th, 21st. Ramesses period. I didn't do 17th, 18th dynasty coffins. In many ways, I still don't. And I need to reach out for help, because these are their own beasts, these 17th, 18th dynasty coffins. But I had access to those. So in 2018, I went back and worked on those pieces. And then I went back again to look at Thutmose III for another go in 2019. So that was the separation in space and time, and now the publication now. It took a while for this to see. It's still taking a while for this to see the light of day. Yeah.
But I think it's important for people to realize how long some of these studies actually take. You're not banging it out in a year. You're not Stephen King. This is a decade in the making of careful permit gathering, photography, organization. Okay.
Well, and you mentioned the Nemec, though, and it's important to note that those coffins now in the Nemec cannot be photographed. They cannot be easily taken out of those cases. They are now in a space that is very Tutankhamun mask-like. And I think we all know that the more famous the piece, the less it can be closely researched. The only reason that Christian Ekman and Katia Brochat got access to the mask of Tutankhamun is because the beard was glued on with epoxy and they needed to repair it, right? But in those most famous of pieces are the most understudied. Now those royal coffins are in the Nemec, and I don't know when people will get access to them, even to photograph in the way that we did have. And so it's timely, I think, that this book is coming out right before they moved to Nemec. And I didn't get them out because they were moving to Nemec. It was all just serendipitous that these things coincided with each other.
Okay. I could ask many more questions, because I particularly love some of these coffins, but let's move on to the actual substance of coffin reuse and what the book is actually about. Yeah. So you touch on this in the introduction, and I imagine many listeners right now are wondering, why would somebody reuse a coffin that belonged to somebody else, who might even be an ancestor or member of their community? It sort of sounds wrong in some respects to a modern sensibility. Why do we feel that way?
The Egyptians created an extraordinary social separator that separated the elites from the rest of society. But let's go further back to so there's that. You have to also note that very few ancient Egyptians got a coffin in a nesting coffin set, right? That's what it's ideally meant to be. And this is something that is relegated to the top 5%, 3%, 2% of a given community. And so keep that in mind. But then now understanding that maybe 2% of your community got access to a nested coffin set, think of that nested coffin set in the New Kingdom and into the Third Intermediate period. It's in the shape of a human body. It has eyes, nose, and mouth, and hands, and all the parts of a human body that you would expect. It is feminized or masculinized in this gender binary patriarchal society for one or the other. And then it is given an opening of the mouth ceremony that inextricably links the body that is placed within it with the coffin itself. And you put those two things together and you create a fetishized object, an object that in some ways can never be torn asunder from the body that was laid within it without great moral quandary. And that is a situation that the Egyptians created quite purposefully so that people would have permanent ownership of a particular coffin. So this trap has been created where once you get this social bump for putting your ancestor in a coffin, for the family showing that their ancestors get this coffin, and everyone in a village or a community invited to see the ancestor have the opening of the mouth and all of the other funerary transformation, or most of the funerary transformations that you do outside, they see this, they see that this dead person is different from the rest of the dead people. So say you're a sharecropping peasant, you have no shot at ever having access to this kind of coffin, and you go and you see your landlord being buried like this, you realize in your bones, as you're given bread and beer and meat and all kinds of things you might not normally have access to during the funeral, that person is different from you. That is your patron. That person has a different level even to the afterlife. And so the fetishization of the coffin and the human is there. But once you add the social aspect to it, then it becomes clear why coffin reuse must take place and will always take place. Whether it's in the first intermediate period, the second intermediate period, or the third intermediate period, during times of economic chaos and disintegration. When you can't get access to things, it doesn't mean that the elite still don't need to social separate. They do. They need that social separation. Even when there's a decentralization of government, even when there's economic chaos, they're still going to have to prove that. And so the best way to do that is a legal reuse. And I do argue in coffin commerce and in recycling for death that most coffin reuse was legal. It was a rare thing to have an illegal reuse, arguably. I mean, I don't have my time machine. I can't absolutely know this, but that's from the evidence that I see. That's my gut instinct. And you can see legal reuse when you remove just the name and put in another name, or you do the bare minimum for a reuse, or you can see the names of two family members on a particular coffin. You're like, oh, this is happening within the family. Or you see a gender modification and making a male coffin into a female coffin. That if you were stealing a coffin and putting it on the open market, you would buy a coffin for the right gender. You wouldn't have to modify it. And that modification implies, I would argue, a legal family reuse. So then you get to, well, why reuse? Let me make it for everybody. So say everybody could get access to a coffin, which is far from the case. But if you believed in your bones that you needed an object of transformation, a magical object to make sure the dead were transformed into Osiris, into the sun god, into this super ancestor, and that the coffin was the most accessible means of doing this magical act, and you didn't have access to it at a particular time, then the only moral thing to do, the only moral thing would be to take it from an ancestor who had already been transformed, do some sort of magical actions on that body, saying you're sorry, this has to be done, making a separation of the fetishized object from the object and the person, and then assigning that object to another person. And then you have the understanding that transformation only happens in a finite amount of space. Ownership long-term is different from transformation, and that you can have a short-term coffin ownership for transformation primarily, and that is the moral way of making sure that everybody gets access to this kind of transformation. And we don't really know how the peasants of Egypt were buried. We only know by what's left behind. What if the peasantry of Egypt shared in communal coffins that allowed them transformation? Very much like you saw in like Amadeus in the movie, where he's in the church in the coffin, and then they bury him, and that coffin has like a little trap door at the end, and they can just slide his body into the mass grave, the pauper's grave. But you can imagine a shared materiality, coffin materiality of transformation for many people. Maybe a parish coffin kind of thing. I can't prove it, but given how important the coffin is for people, one can imagine that that's the way it would work. Then you add to that the social implications of how you need a rich person. And I live in the United States of America, and let me tell you, the rich people really do need to socially separate and show their wealth to everyone to prove that they have a different health, they have a different youth, a different vitality, all of these things, and different, in addition to material wealth and separation from the unclean masses, however you understand that. But for the Egyptians, if you were an elite family and all of a sudden there's this war or invasion of sea peoples or both, and the economy's collapsed and you cannot get wood, the wood is all being used for military purposes, or let's say that there are great stands of sycamore and acacia growing for the use of coffin making and furniture making in the Delta, and these have all been ravished in some way, and you can't get wood, then the best way for you to prove, say you're the son of a very important father, a very important family, and you're burying the patriarch, the only way for you to prove that you're able to inherit that power and able to put your best foot forward as the new patriarch of that patron family is to bury your father in a coffin with all eyes on it for everyone to see. And if that means you have to go into your funerary burial chamber, your family sepulcher, and pull out a nesting coffin, maybe of the 18th dynasty, somebody, nobody remembers, how many generations can you go back in your own family, and you pull that coffin out and you redecorate it, then who's to know, right? And you can actually see the adaptations of the Thebans. This is all a Theban discussion in this book, Recycling for Death, but you can see, and other books to come, the adaptations of the Thebans as they do reuse at the beginning. Well, they're like, oh, just put the new decoration right on top of the varnished decoration, the old one. It'll be fine. That's the coffin of Amunhotep in the British Museum I was looking at with John Taylor, 20th dynasty piece. They're like, oh yeah, no problem. They don't really know how to do the reuse. They're trying to do it in a quick way. By the time you get to the mid 21st dynasty, the artisan knows, and the family patrons and commissioners know, that you can't just put new decoration onto a varnished surface. It's going to pop off. You have to take that old varnished surface off. You need to chisel that away, and you need to put on a new plastered and painted and varnished surface. And it makes the reuse that much more difficult to catch. But it means that the people are learning how to do this better. And it means that it's becoming more de rigueur. It's what people have to do to show their social place in society. It's a social necessity. And I talk about this trap a lot more in my book, Coffin Commerce, which, but in Recycling for Death too, it's in there. So, it's an interesting thing once you establish an object, that the object has power over the people. We like to think that we humans are all powerful and in control of everything. But when you create an object type, whether it's a coffin or a wedding dress or a car, that object has power over you. There are expectations. There's a habitus of how it should be used, expectations of the daughter being able to get married in the mother's wedding dress. She's not going to get married in her father's old tuxedo. She's going to get married in the mother's wedding dress. She's not going to wear her mother's old prom dress. That wouldn't make sense. She's going to do something, there are rules, in short. And the Egyptians had their own rules about that, how these objects could be used. And so, I'm just using these coffins to try to figure out how the elites worked their magic to create power that they could sustain over generations, and how that magic that is created through the coffin is also applied to them in turn, and they have to kind of do things they wouldn't otherwise have done.
Why does the reuse of a coffin feel wrong to a modern sensibility?
Ah,
specifically?
well, I think, yeah. So that's the fetishization. Eh, That's the, well,
Sorry,
one,
can I
we
just
have a
interject?
problem with, yeah,
When
go ahead.
we when you've used this word a few times, but within a religious or academic context, what do you mean by fetishization specifically?
That the object has a power from its own side. It attains a power from its own side. It's not um like I bought this television set from this place and it's just a television set and I could sell it at a swap meet and it would be no problem. It's it's that it's an object that you inherited or that was specially attained and specially ordered. The object needs to be treated with respect in a way that other objects don't.
Mm.
So it's almost been divinized, or it has been divinized, really. An opening of the mouth divinizes the object, it divinizes the dead inside, it connects the two together. So it's not just any object. It's now something different. And I think this is one reason that when we put coffins into museums in the Western world, however you define that, we separate the body from the coffin because we don't want the owner, quote unquote, to be there in the coffin telling us how or how we cannot treat that object. So we'll put the owner in someplace else. Like in the Met, they sent all the owners to the Peabody Museum of Anthropology and the coffins all went to the Met, right? And so then the object is de-accessioned from its owner and you have more control over how you work with that piece. But if the owner is still in there, now you're talking about a grave. It's a graveyard, it's a burial that's still active. How do you work with that? And we have these issues today as you see museum curators dealing with the quandary of what to do with the bodies that are in these objects. Do they display them? Do they not display them? Do they cover them? How do they cover them? All of these issues. But in the ancient world, you can imagine that when, say, you're doing some legal reuse and you go into the old family tomb, there at the beginning, there must have been an interest in choosing the objects of the least remembered ancestors. So let's take Theban tomb 1 as an example. So
Mhm.
everyone says Theban tomb 1 of Senedjem at Deir Medina was discovered intact.
Mm.
And I would say it hasn't been discovered intact. It's been discovered as a 20th dynasty iteration of itself. It's not its 19th dynasty self. There aren't any 20th dynasty coffins in there. There are only 19th dynasty coffins in there. And the coffins from Theban tomb 1 are split up in many different museums. It's very frustrating.
Mm.
Like, there'll be one in Brussels, a couple in Cairo, a couple in New York. There's one in St. Petersburg that I've never seen. The Shopties and the canopic jars are all over the place too. It's a mess in terms of the assemblage and where they all are. But it seems there was an interest by the descendants of Senedjem and Khonsu that they not be touched or that they not be completely touched, right? So Khonsu has an outer coffin, an inner coffin, a mummy board, mask, and his sarcophagus is there. It was in pieces against the wall, but it was there. Senedjem does not have an outer coffin. He has an inner coffin, he has a board, he has a mask, and he has his sarcophagus in pieces against the wall. Did he have an outer coffin? It's arguable. It makes sense that he would have had such a thing, but he does not now.
Mm.
And then there's like the coffin of Iset, which is just the coffin of Iset. Where's the rest of her nesting set? She's got a mask and a coffin. That's it. Where are the rest of the pieces? We should assume she had an outer coffin as well. Did she have a sarcophagus? Maybe not. But there was interest by the descendants of keeping those patriarchs intact because they were special. They were the ones who painted the tomb. Their images were all over the tomb burial chamber and tomb chapel. So this is what needed to be maintained, and that fetishization was working on them too. So it's not just who's most recent do we remember, who's most important do we remember, who's male, who's female, who has more power in society. So the fetishization of the coffin, like don't touch that, that belongs to a dead person, will only work so far when you actually really need the wood. But it will work if there's somebody really important and you want to maintain that connection to that ancestor. which, okay, and this brings me to another point, and I'd like to bring up the letter to the dead woman Ichtai, which is, I think, Ostracon Louvre 698. Maybe you can look it up. I'm just coming up with this off the top of my head, but you can look at Franson's publication of this letter to the dead. And this letter to the dead is written by Butekh-Amen, the late 20th into the 21st dynasty. Deir Medina fame, went all over the Valley of the Kings and helped to recommodify and reuse, recycle all of these royal coffins. And he writes a letter to his dead wife. And the letter's like, it is addressed to the Afdet of Ichtai. It is not addressed to his dead wife directly. It is addressed to the container of her, to the material thing. So it is to the Afdet of Ichtai. How are you doing? Are you okay? This is how my life is. Look, we really need you. We need the super ancestor now because I got this problem and that problem. And I am obviously paraphrasing. But that right there is a super useful cue, because you understand that talking to the ancestors only going to get you so far in this material world of flesh and bone and trees and things and desert sands that we live in. You've got to write to the material thing that has been activated. That material thing is going to pull the spirit of the super ancestor into your material world so that they can act. And so taking a coffin away from an ancestor meant, I have to imagine in the ancient Egyptian mind, that you then didn't have the ability to as easily pull them into your material space to act on your behalf as an ancestor. And maybe we in the modern world just instinctively understand this, but there were real rules attached to this in the ancient world. And one wonders where the coffin of Ichtai, this Afdet, it's an old-fashioned word, where this went. Was it reused? Were the family, did they remember her? Once Butekh-Amen and his son had gone, did anyone really care? You don't know, but the coffin, it did things. It was really a transformational device in the moment, but then over the long-term ownership, it was, even if you couldn't see it in front of your face and it was buried in a burial chamber, you didn't go in there all the time, it had a power to connect you with that spirit. So it answers why the ancient Egyptians might think it wrong. But as for us, why we think it's wrong, I would go to the basics of it having a face, eyes that are looking at you, hands, that it just seems very, very wrong. And I'll end by saying that, my work has received a lot of pushback by people who are Egyptian and not Egyptian, because I'm showing that people did something that they might think is immoral. Modern people might think is immoral. And who am I to expose something like this or to assume something like this? It's problematic for people to talk about still. And in a more nationalist leaning Egypt, it can be problematic for some people to talk about.
Okay, so that kind of explores the religious, symbolic, personal, economic aspects of coffin reuse. Looking at it more generally, sort of as a historical trend,
Yeah.
In the book, you sort of break down at least from the Theban material, the changes in coffin reuse over time, where it peaks and troughs and goes up, and different habits change. So right off the bat, just to set the scene, do certain historical periods seem to have higher levels of reuse than others?
Yeah. Okay, so the answer is yes. And those periods are going to be what you would expect. You're going to see more reuse in the time periods when government centralization is failing, when the social contract is being ripped up before your eyes. And it's also the time period, arguably, when you have some of the most Baroque production, some of the most over-the-top production. I think in many ways, we live at that Baroque time right now, and we might be heading into some of the reuse rather soon. But so you're going to have a lot of reuse in the 20th and 21st dynasties, less reuse in the 19th and the 18th dynasties. And I can't talk about the 22nd because I haven't done that systematic evaluation. And I rely on the work of others, like Lisa Sartini, to do 18th dynasty reuse examination. There is less reuse in the 18th, during the 18th. Not of an 18th dynasty coffin reused in the 21st that you see, but 18th dynasty coffin reused during the 18th, you see less of it. You see less of it in the 19th. And I know the 19th coffins quite well because that was my book, Cost of Death. And when you see the reuse is end of the 19th, maybe into the 20th. And, you know, you're dating stylistically. So this isn't easy, this kind of dating. And so there's that, and it's what you would expect. And then somebody who's working on Middle Kingdom, they'll be like, oh yeah, that works for me. You know, there's a lot more reuse in the first intermediate period and the second intermediate period on either side of that centralized Middle Kingdom core. When the elites are really able to create security systems that protect their stuff. It's one thing we talk about in the United States all the time right now is this police force and everyone putting more money into police. What are police for but to protect the goods and services of the wealthy? And so we keep putting in more money in our budgets for police forces to protect the stuff of the wealthy. Why? Because the wealthy know they're hoarding all of the stuff. And so they want to have more police forces to make sure those things are protected. And you could argue that in the 19th and early 20th dynasty, you had those same kinds of security forces. When social contracts break down, those same security forces will act against you, and you will get theft from within by those people who have the most access and who are supposed to protect. Now, we're talking about two different kinds of reuse, because the reuse that would happen in an elite necropolis, like Sheikh Abdul Gorna, for example, is going to be very different than the reuse that's going to happen in a royal necropolis, like the Valley of the Kings, Valley of the Queens. And there, the reuse is much more, the patterns are very interesting. For example, there are some, not many, but there are some 17th and 18th dynasty royal kings' coffins preserved. There are no kings' coffins preserved from the 19th or 20th dynasties. I'm not talking about sarcophagi, I'm talking about coffins made of wood. And one might wonder, you know, why is the coffin in which Thutmose III was reburied? It might have been his coffin originally. We don't know, because that inscription for him had to have been applied later. Same with Second Enretau. Was it originally made for him? We don't know. That inscription had to have been applied later. But they have a style that would fit with the time of Second Enretau and Thutmose III. But Ramesses II, he's reburied in a coffin that is certainly, almost certainly, post-Amarna. And that's Nicholas Reeves' argument. And I agree with him that it's probably Horemheb. It could be but it's a post-Amarna coffin. Ramesses II is not reburied in a Ramessid period coffin. Why? And this is where reuse choices are determined by what the coffin was made of. And I would argue, though I can't prove it, that the Ramessid coffins were made mostly of solid gold through and through. So if Tutankhamun, our nothing king, right? Poor Tutankhamun, is buried with a solid gold inner coffin and then two nesting surrounding coffins of wood veneered with gold, sheet gold and or foil, then if you're reusing, you might take the gold foil or the sheet gold off of the outer coffins and then reuse that wood. That would be a really good way to reuse those coffins. But the inner coffin, no way. If you're at a time period of extraordinary government collapse and you need to fund the regime and you're doing this reuse yourself, you're going to take that solid gold coffin and you will recommodify it. You might make it into pieces of gold that you can pay your men with. You might use it to make your new coffins that you deposit at Tanis. You may use one mask of Tutankhamun-like quality and create the gold foil for an entire coffin set at Tanis, right? And so you can use that gold in other ways, and that would be why we don't have any Ramessid period king's coffins, but we do have 18th dynasty king's coffins. And then you get an understanding of who's spending, whose tombs were more Baroque and expensive and whose were less. There are tells here for an 18th dynasty original tomb. And for that, I would encourage everyone to look to the dissertation that will soon be published by Nicholas Brown, who's just finished at UCLA. It won't be out for a couple of years in book form, but that's where I would look for that data. He's really tried to reconstruct the 18th dynasty original tomb.
Okay. Are you able to provide a reference for me later so I can put it in the description?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Just to clarify one question there, because I imagine some people will be a bit confused. So when you say there are no Ramesses coffins for the kings, what you mean is the coffins they were found in have all been repurposed from earlier tombs. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we've got Ramesses II. Before him, you have Sety I. You have Merneptah. You have these kings in their bodily form, but they have been placed into coffins that were not, most of them have been, if not all of them, have been placed into coffins that were not originally their own, and they have been placed in single coffins, not nested coffins. And those coffins were probably very valuable originally, but they are stripped of their gilding or gold sheeting or whatever was on them. And then there is just the wood, and there might have been a re-gilding of a cheaper variety, like the coffin in which Thutmose III was buried shows that gold sheeting was removed, and then it was replastered and re-gilded, and then that gilding was later removed. So there are multiple generations deciding different things as they rebury these kings. So maybe the first time they reburied these kings under Horemheb, right? Horemheb is the lieutenant under the late Ramesses, maybe working for Payank, the high priest of Amun, is going in. His name is on many of these earlier reburials, and he's pulling out coffin nesting sets that maybe are made of solid gold. Let's imagine the coffin set of Ramesses II, made of solid gold through and through, 3 coffins. He takes them all, but he's still got to rebury Ramesses II. And Ramesses II is the king, right? Maybe not as important as Thutmose III, but maybe I would say he's up there, right? And so you need to give him a coffin that's very nice. So they chose a king's coffin for Ramesses II, but it has no gilding on it whatsoever. It's been stripped of all of its gilding. It's got removal of wood that shows that gilding was forcibly removed. There's a hanging mortise on the outside of one of the shoulders, actually. So you can see that surface area of the cedar wood was removed from this coffin. But they felt the need to put Ramesses II into another king's coffin. And what kind of coffin do they pick? Well, whichever king's coffin is made of wood, and that seems to have been the norm for the 18th dynasty, less so arguably for the 19th and 20th, because we don't have those Ramesses king's coffins that date to that period. So when you look at the coffin of Ramesses II, say you all Googled, everyone who's listening, you're like, I'm Googling the coffin of Ramesses II. It says it right there. That's why in the book, I say the coffin in which Ramesses II was reburied, because it is not the coffin of Ramesses II. And the coffin of Thutmose III is not necessarily the coffin of Thutmose III. It could be in terms of style and date, the way it looks, but it might be the coffin of Amunhotep II. So it's the coffin in which Thutmose III was reburied. And it's a confusing way to understand it, but yeah.
Sure. So that brings me to another question. Say, for example, they're reburying a king, say Sety I, for example. They're putting him into a coffin that is not originally his. Do we see any evidence of them modifying those coffins, like their design, their shape, their decoration, not just writing on them, but actually recarving them in any way to make them more suitable for the person?
Yeah, absolutely. So these coffins, as they are found, are single coffins. It is quite possible that when this recoffining was first happening, that they gave them more than one, maybe 2 coffins, maybe 3 coffins. But as we have them now, we have just one. And that one coffin has to do everything. And so, you need a coffin that's more or less the same size as the other coffins. You don't necessarily want a coffin that's super huge, though we do have that for Ahmose Nefertari, right? She has a coffin that's very, very large.
I love that coffin. It's one of my favorites.
It's amazing. Yeah. Could not open that one up, as you can imagine. We could just get on our step ladder and no, we could not. I wish someday this will happen, but not for me. But so let's look at Sety I. Sety I was reburied in what was almost certainly an 18th dynasty outer piece, or a second coffin, but a big coffin. 18th dynasty coffins as a whole were bigger than 19th dynasty coffins, which as a whole were bigger than 21st dynasty coffins. They get smaller and more compact through time, probably to keep up with the lack of space and the demand for more hidden spaces for these coffins. So by the time you get to the 21st, people are like, no big stuff. We can't hide that in this cliffside tomb. So just keep it small. So to rebury Sety I, they use this large outer coffin that Peter Lacovara suggests was originally an 18th dynasty queen's coffin. I'm not going to, of the 18th dynasty, and I'm not going to go that far and absolutely say this was a queen's coffin. I can't see gender in it. He sees gender in the lappets, and the lappets have been redone. So let's look at Sety I. Maybe you can Google it, coffin of Sety I, as you're listening. And
I've got the pictures that are in the book here. And I'll put specific links in the episode description if anyone wants to go look at the same photos. So let's, for example, look at the Deir black and white photo that you use for Sety I on the first page.
Yeah.
Can you maybe walk that through from like top to bottom? Where do you see?
Yeah, let me go to my box and get to the same thing so that I can look at it and not just do it from my mind's eye. Okay, there we go. So look at the woodwork first. It's important to remember that decoration is always done last. Any application of new text or face decoration, that's almost certainly going to be last. So you want to look at how the woodworking is being changed. This coffin was cut down from a much larger piece, and we only have the lid. You don't have the case, so I can't say the case was also cut down. It's quite possible, and this is something you see all the time with 21st dynasty reuse, that you have a coffin case of an inner coffin or a second coffin that's combined with the lid of an outer coffin that's been shaved down, cut down to fit. And I suspect that's what is happening here. We don't have the case, but the lid is really nice wood, beautiful inlaid eyes that seem to fit an Amunhotep III aesthetic. And the sides of it have been shaved down. So the piece has been made smaller, and the width of the sides has been made smaller. And then if you look at the lappets, those head cloth pieces that hang down onto the breast, onto the chest, you can see even in the Deir photo that the one on the coffin's right is thicker in section than the one on the coffin's left. And you can see it even better in person, but you get an idea that there was modification done here that was rather hurried or not very complete, but they're modifying it. They're changing this from and you look at the one on the coffin's left, and you can see that it was probably rectangular in shape. Maybe it was for a striped headcloth, or maybe it was for a woman, as Peter Lacovara suggests. And there has been indeed a cut to create a curvature on the outsides that is more in keeping with a Nemi style headdress. So there is an attempt. It doesn't look like a Nemi's, right? Because you would have to have another cut at the shoulder, and there would need to be that width, which they can't really add. Maybe they added it in plaster and it's not survived. That's completely possible. Lots of modifications were done in plaster that then falls apart, but you only need it for the funeral and you're good and you move along. I wouldn't be surprised if there was a plaster addition to add a width for that Nemi's at the shoulders, top of the shoulders that is fallen away. And you can see the top of the head, how rough it is, that it's been cut down, carved down.
Off kilter a little bit.
It is off kilter. And yet you can see the piece was then replastered, and there are remnants of gilding on this piece. There are remnants of gilding in the eye, that large eyelid area. And And you can see that when they cut this piece down, they re-gilded it nonetheless, which is really, really interesting. And notice how big the eyes are. Just that. The eyes don't fit the size of the piece. They're too big, but they're such a beautiful inlay, and it seems not of something precious enough to take because it's glass, that they left those there. And then you notice the hands are a little off kilter, right? So the coffin's left hand is smaller than the coffin's right hand, and that seems to have been okay, or the best that they could do. And maybe there was plaster used to help that. And you can see the plaster on the mid body that's still adhering. Sorry about the dogs. I'm going to stop for a bit. Okay, now we're getting better. Okay. So notice that the plaster on the mid body is applied after. This is the kind of work you have to do. It's applied after the modification of the wood. So they modified this piece from someone else, changed the wood, made it smaller, and then replastered it and re-gilded it. So it's not like when they're taking these coffins, they're just like, sorry, king, we're just going to put you in this old crappy coffin now. Good, good on you. At the beginning, they tried to do it right. They're like, if we're going to take all the solid gold pieces of Sety I, we can at least give him something gilded in return. And there is that piety. There's also I would argue, and I do argue in Recycling for Death, a competitive element to this. The high priests of Amun, who are doing this at the end of the 20th dynasty with men like Payank and Horemheb as their lieutenants, don't want everyone to know how much they've taken. Okay. And so it's a very useful thing to then take all of this stuff and then display to the other elites, the other high priests, the other courtiers, the other everybody, that they are reburying Sety I in a coffin of gold, or a coffin or two of gold. And then as the generations go by, you can see that plastered gilding, that gilded plaster, has also been removed. And you can see the rough chiseling of the entire surface that is the remnant of that gilded plaster. And you can see texts that are put over that. You've got Men Mot Re, you've got the throne name of Sety I over that plaster removal. So it's clear that this was added after the gilding, and you can then date that. And I don't remember the name, or I'd have to look at when exactly that text was added, but I think it's a Penegem I text, I believe. So your reburial by Horemheb would have included more wealth than the reburial later on by Penegem I as high priest of Amun, in the absence of any king besides himself at Thebes. And you have overlapping texts, right? You have a hieratic text down below that I think is separate in time from the text up above. And yeah, but it's quite a complicated. Oh, and the ears. Check out the ears and the uraeus. So the other modification after they removed what must have been a gold sheeting that had ears on it. Once those ears are removed, you can't have a coffin without ears in the Egyptian mind, right? They need to be able to hear your prayers, and they need to be made into a fully functioning human with eyes, nose, ears, mouth, hands, all of the things. And so the ears are carefully painted on in a black and red paint. And the uraeus, which was almost certainly originally there, and maybe a gold of some kind or a gilded wood, which has since been taken, that's been painted on as well. And there was probably a royal beard that was tied on, and that's been removed. You can't really paint on the entire royal beard, but you can paint on the chin strap, and that has been done. So there's an attempt to make good, but you're seeing here on this one Deir photo, with a careful examination of that one photo, probably 3 different iterations of a coffin. The original 18th dynasty, then the reuse with gilding, plastered gilding, probably a gold foil, and then all of that removed and the hieratic text added on top of that. There may be another. The ears lend they make me think that maybe there was another use in between of a gold sheeting that was allowed to exist for a while. So this is complicated. And in the absence of things, I can't say exactly what it was. I can just say that it was reused, and this is what we have here. So, yeah.
Just a couple of questions that sort of come to mind as might be things people are wondering.
Yeah.
So the initial reuse from the 18th dynasty original to a new plastered and gilded casket for Sety I. Then the gold gets stripped off again because they need it. New details get painted on where they used to be in nice metal. It's still Sety I. Possibly there's another phase of thing that you just touched upon of modification. Then it winds up in the cache, the Deir el-Bahari cache, gets discovered by Deir, originally intact, but then somehow the bottom half is lost. We don't know where it is yet right now. Is that a correct timeline for this?
Yeah.
Coffins?
You've got it. I might put the ears with the gold sheeting, which is going to be of much higher value, earlier than you did. So I would put that before the gold foil plaster layer. But otherwise, that's right on. Yeah, with all of that wood modification and everything. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So with all these reburials and all these moving about, coffins getting modified, changed, going to workshops, coming back to workshops, all that jazz, all the kerfuffle of taking them from multiple tombs and changing them, sending them to a single tomb. The big question is, how likely is it that with all these coffins swapping around, kind of like a Matryoshka doll back and forth, what are the odds that some of the mummies within have been misidentified or mislabeled?
It's super possible. I will say that it seems more possible to us now because the mummies as they exist, all except for Amunhotep I, are all unwrapped. And the Egyptians would never have left these mummies unwrapped for long. Yes, they did open up their wrappings and think of what was on Tutankhamun. My gods, right? All of that gold, all of that silver, all of those precious inlaid objects. That would have been on all of the other kings too. So they unwrapped them, however we understand that, took all of those objects. In the early attestations of these coffins, the early iterations, they probably would have left some of these objects on those kings when they rewrapped them. They probably were unwrapped and rewrapped multiple times, depending on the cultural memory of what had been left inside. But each time that they unwrapped and rewrapped a coffin, I would just say, remember who's doing this and who has the impunity to do this. This is done by the high priesthood of Amun. Even mercenary men, I use that word knowing what I'm saying, like Payank or Herihor, became high priests of Amun, partly because it grants a certain immunity to do this important work with the right kind of magic, the right kind of text and spell and ritual to make sure the kings are not going to come after you, that they'll be protected, that you are there as their pious agent. To be their pious agent, you can't mix up the names. So as long as you're dealing with a wrapped body that has the braces, or if it's a third intermediate period body, for those braces that go across the chest and hold the mummy intact, you might have those on an 18th or 19th dynasty body, maybe not in leather, but marked possibly as well. But as long as you've got a shroud on that body that's marked, it's going to be intact. The problem is when we unwrap these things, when we do it, and then we take off the braces, and then we mix it out. Well, I don't know which belong to which. And we take off all of the wrappings and we don't carefully keep the inscribed linens. Then it gets super confusing. So I would say most of the misidentification of the mummies is on us rather than these high priests. The high priests knew that they were doing work that was along a knife's edge of morality and immorality. They needed to keep these kings, these divine ancestors on their side. And indeed, the coffins of Ramesses II, Thutmose III, second Amunhotep indicate that even at the very end, when they're taking every last piece of gold that they can possibly get, that they are remembering the names, uttering the names in ritual magic, that they are making sure that they are connecting with those ancestors to gain some of their power. So it would not have served them to mix them up. Now, did they put some kings in different coffins marked for different kings? Yes. And for that, I would look to Nick Reeves' work, his Decline of the Valley of the Kings. Still to this day, the best work on that subject. And I don't try to replicate or deal with that. That's his work, and it's really brilliantly done. So whether a coffin belongs to a king, that's a different thing. And interestingly enough, at the end of I think there was more care taken in the first 2 or 3 removals of goods. But when you get to the last removal and you're into the 22nd dynasty, there's much less interest in getting it absolutely right, because there's much less interest in these ancestor kings by the 22nd dynasty. They're the ones that put them away. They're the ones that don't need Thutmose III and Ramesses II to parade in some way to show that they're the caretakers of anymore. Because each time you take a king out and you say, we need to rebury him, you then show your connection to that king. And when you're showing yourself reburying him with a gilded coffin, and maybe he's in, a temple at Karnak or Medinet Habu, we don't know where these kings were buried and or given their magical intercessions and who was there to witness that. But it was a way of showing their power and connection to the past. When they're put away in the cache, no one needs them anymore. The 22nd dynasty kings or high priests of Amun, they're just like, yeah, don't need them. Put them away. And there's less interest. And that's when the most brutal intercessions were done. Like the final hacking of the gold of the coffin of Thutmose III, for example, was done when they were put into that final cache and were less in people's minds and hearts. So I would say the mummies are probably pretty well identified, except for, there are some unmarked bodies that are problematic. Ramesses I is a problem. And there are others. There are others who are problems. And I try not to get into the mummies because it's funny that I'm just doing the coffins, and I have to do that, right? I have to be like, just here to do the coffins, you guys. I'm not going to do the mummies. That's for other people, because I don't want to step on the toes of people who can much better work with the mummified remains than I can. I'm no bioarchaeologist, so I work with what I do best. We all have our silos to work within. Yeah.
Days are long gone where one researcher could cover every aspect of a burial.
Absolutely.
Yeah. For better, for much better.
Yeah.
I will ask you now to speculate horribly.
I hate that.
Of course.
She says ironically.
We don't like dealing in hypothetical.
Yeah.
Several notable rulers are still missing from the coffin and mummy record. How likely is it, do you think, that there is another cache out there, or do you think they're likely just lost due to destruction?
Yeah. And again, I'll point everyone towards a scholar who's done this speculation with the best of evidence, and that would be Nicholas Reeves in his Decline of the Valley of the Kings, where he talks about a cache in the tomb of Horemheb, and Horemheb being missing, I being missing, and other kings of that date being associated with that cache that showed, and the tomb shows remnants of, or showed remnants of coffins hacked up. So it seems that was hit by tomb robbery, and it's largely gone. If anything will ever be found, I have no idea. And then there's the later Ramessid kings, right? The Ramesses XI and Ramesses the 10th, or maybe they reused the same piece or whatever. Where are those? Were they brought to Per-Ramses and then to Tanis or something like that? We don't know. And then there's the Amarna kings, and I'll point everyone to Nick Reeves again. And I will say flat out again that the people who ridicule Nick Reeves's theory about the tomb behind the tomb of Tutankhamun do so at their peril. We're not politically at a space where we can look and see what's behind that tomb. But I'll repeat again that I sent those, I sent 2 sets of scans of ground penetrating radar scans to JPL and Caltech, and received word back that there were indeed there were voids behind the back wall and the left wall in the final burial room of Tutankhamun. What is behind there, I don't know. But the notion that Tutankhamun was buried in the front widened foyer of a previous tomb makes a whole lot of sense to me with the evidence that's there.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so there's that as well, which I don't think would have been cached because it wasn't remembered, because it wasn't in the cultural memory of the men like Butech Amun and his father Jehuti Moza, who went through and helped the high priests of Amun get the tombs that were in their cultural memory. So
Okay.
there's a lot missing. There's a lot missing.
So it's not like, so I'm probably not going to get a cache with Horemheb in it, am I?
I don't think so. I don't think so. Because I think his tomb was very much like Amenhotep II's, right? Where you have all of those coffins and bodies, Amenhotep II, Amenhotep III. No one wanted Amenhotep III. How interesting, right? Thutmose IV is in there. These kings that I argue, and I think I'm the first to argue this, that the high priests of Amun didn't want to have anything to do with these guys. These weren't the guys they wanted to connect with. They wanted to connect with the Ramesses II of the world, the Thutmose IIIs of the world, the Thutmose I. They took his coffin. Penedjem reused it. He wanted that much to be him. Second Enrei Tao. These were the kings that were the beginnings of things, not the endings of things, as I say in Recycling for Death. And most of the late Ramessids and the anyone connected to Akhenaten's regime, they're like, no, far be it from us to connect with them. And so they were left in that cache. And you have to imagine that people were able to go in and out of that place. There would have been some security, of course, in the 21st and 22nd dynasties in this space because of what was there. But people were able to go through and rifle through and look at those coffins and take whatever they wanted. And the coffins that they're in suggest as much lower quality, much less respect given to these dead compared to those in the cache at Deir el-Bahari 320 or Theban Tomb 320. And I would argue it's the same for Horemheb. They just left them there. And whoever wanted at them, you want some gold, there's some gold there or whatever. I don't want to be so blithe with these things, but like there was just less respect given to those particular kings. I'm sure all the gold was gone from Horemheb's tomb by the time they left it open like that. Yeah.
Can't win everything. Okay.
No.
So that brings me to the end of my questions about coffin reuse generally. If you have time, I have a few little rapid fire,
Of course.
fun, lighthearted questions.
Yeah.
If you had to pick, what is your favorite coffin from the royal caches?
Well, it has to be Thutmose III. That coffin, I ruined a dinner party with Salima Ikram because of that coffin. I was at a party with we were probably 20 of us. And I had just seen that coffin and I brought in my iPad and I started to pass it around. I'm like, you guys, this coffin, the inside of this coffin, this decoration that is decorated in an 18th dynasty fashion with this netting pattern. That's Nicholas Brown, who suggests it's a netting pattern. And I think he's right. These lines that go down and then are crossed at 90 degrees at certain intervals. And then there's this long cartouche and a cartouche within that long cartouche that has the names of Thutmose III and a prayer for his revivification. But that can't have been applied until the 21st dynasty because there are multiple mortise and tenons on the case side. So I'm passing this iPad around at this dinner party and everyone got super invested in this coffin. So it has destroyed one dinner party, but the coffin, if you look at it like an archaeologist and you look at the mortise and tenons and you can see it in front of you, that coffin. So there are sections where you can see the mortises were placed in the middle of a much thicker coffin side. And as more was removed from that coffin, each time you chisel away gilding, you chisel away sections of wood. You're going to be taking off 3, 4, 5, 6 centimeters each time you do that. So then the mortise moved a little bit over. And it seems they re-gilded it because they removed more. There wouldn't have been removal of the wood unless there was something precious attached to it. So there's precious metal attached. A mortise is sunk in the middle. That precious material is removed along with wood, and a new mortise is sunk throughout that coffin. Mortises are sunk into the new middle, and then it is re-gilded, right, with that new middle. And then they come again and they take away that new gilding, and they sink another mortise in the new middle, and it's a little over to the side, and you can see the old mortises are now falling off the side of the coffin. They're like mortises that don't even have a side anymore. Right? You see this on the coffin of Ramesses II too, by the way, much more carefully hidden than Thutmose III. And then there was a final gilding of that coffin, which was then roughly hacked away. So this coffin was opened and closed at least twice, maybe more. And that opening and closing each time, that recoffining, that wechem keres, repeating of burial, was as useful for the high priesthood of Amun as anybody else. They're saying, something has happened to the coffin of Thutmose III. We have come in, only we can fix it, and we have come in to fix it. I'm making things up. I am hypothesizing. I don't know exactly how they would have communicated this to their people, but they're still presenting themselves as the pious caretakers of this particular king, more than a king like Amunhotep III, for example. Caretakers of Ramesses II, more than a coffin of Thutmose IV, for example, or Ramesses I. And so you see that the high priesthood of Amun is making choices about which king serves them best. Like, let's connect to American politics for a bit and think about all those originalists who are popping up in American politics, who are talking about how wonderful Jefferson, or not Jefferson Davis, but some are actually, but how wonderful Thomas Jefferson was. And then somebody on the left will be like, but he was a slave owner and had children with a woman that he sexually abused from the age of 14, right? Sally Hemings, lest we forget her name. But so there are people who will see Thomas Jefferson as very good, and other people who will see Thomas Jefferson as very bad. But Thomas Jefferson, his cultural memory serves a certain political view. And here with the high priesthood of Amun, like Penegem I up to Penegem II, with Masaharta in between, this Thutmose III character, as remembered, the one that went to Megiddo, the one that said to his generals, no, you're wrong, I'm right, we're going to do it this way. They loved this military king. They loved this conqueror, this guy that was able to go out into the Levant and take charge. We've read the tale of Wen Amun. We know that this is a time period when going out into the outer reaches of the world was not easy for men like Herihor or Payank before him, and arguably Penegem I as well. So, this Thutmose III, and we also know that Payank and Herihor, they're military men. So they want to connect to this Thutmose III guy. And when I see the coffin of Thutmose III opened up, and I love that one page that I did that shows all the mortise and tenons with little red lines on it, so you can see how many there are, that there was great attention given to this coffin, that people kept coming back to him. They needed more from him. He needed to give them more. They needed to take more. It reminds me of that Shel Silverstein book, a children's book called The Giving Tree. It's a horrible book about a boy that keeps going back to the tree, and he takes its apples, and then he takes the branches to build his house. And by the time he's an old man, the tree is a stump. He's taken everything from it. And that's kind of what this coffin of Thutmose III is. It's just the stump of the cedar of the coffin that was, with case sides that are so thin, they can barely sustain the shape of the coffin. You can see through it in parts. The wood has been broken through. But it's a testament to how important Thutmose III was. And then if you look at the coffins of the 21st dynasty high priests, only some of them got to put Thutmose III in 2 dimensions on their backboards, on the interior that their mummy would have been laying upon. So when somebody in the ancient world, has a coffin made for them, they say, I am Osiris. Well, the 21st dynasty high priests were also saying, I am Thutmose III, or I am Amunhotep I. Amunhotep I was a more common king to claim. You had way more Amenhotep I on the backboard of 21st dynasty coffins than you did of Thutmose III. But it's that Thutmose III coffin that is really the holy grail, the linchpin between the 18th dynasty coffins and the 21st dynasty high priests. He's that sacred super ancestor that they need to connect with, that gives them the impunity to serve and rule as they do. And it's also the way he's brutally hacked at the end is a testament to the resentment, I would argue, that the 22nd dynasty brought to bear against these high priests who hoarded these kings to themselves and all of their riches and all of the Valley of the Kings stuff. I mean, can you imagine? Can you hypothesize what was in the tomb of Ramesses II, Thutmose III, Thutmose I? What kinds of riches and things were on their bodies? These high priests used their religious shield to take from these kings at the same time that they were the pious caretakers. But the 22nd dynasty Tanis kings who came in after and broke that high priesthood were like, oh yeah, you think this is for you? Here, watch what we can do. And they go after Thutmose III as hard as they go after that priesthood. He is a representative of them too. And it's, it's everything.
That sounds like another very big story that we don't have time to get into now, but I want to put a pin in that for the next time we have an interview, because it sounds like you've got a much larger historical tale going on here than we're able to cover in this specific context. And
someday I will write it. And I tried to pitch it to National Geographic, and they were like, "Who's Nojmet? Who's Harry Hoare?" So we'll do a different book first, but I'll come back to it, because there is a rip-roaring tale that involves mercenary generals turning into priests to take over all of this wealth, to then become these magicians who use the bodies of former kings to control a population. It's an amazing tale, to be sure.
Final question. No, sorry. Second to last question.
Second to last. Go for it.
Hypothetically, let's say you decide to prepare your own funeral and burial goods in an ancient Egyptian style.
Yeah.
What sort of thing would you want to put on your Egyptian coffin, and what would you want it to look like?
I saw that question. I'm like, oh, wow. I don't really know, but let me just say, when you look at a 21st dynasty coffin, aren't you blown away by all of the polychrome decoration and all of the different Book of the Dead or Amduat kind of extractions and this competition of intellectual capacity to or connection to a certain text, restricted knowledge, really. And yet, when I think about those coffins were only made in that way to reuse with impunity. That polychrome plaster is the best way of hiding reuse, because everyone's so busy looking at all of the decoration and the different, oh my God, he used that from the Book of Gates, or he used that from the Book of Earth, and all the restricted knowledge, and what is he daring to put on here? They're not seeing that the coffin was necessarily reused. It's a really good sleight of hand. It's like the best magician's trick ever. And the fact that it was perfected by high priests is even better, right?
So they literally whitewashed it.
They really did. Yes, they literally plastered it over. And that's why whenever I'm looking for coffin reuse, I'm like, open it up. And if I can't get a coffin opened up and see the inside that no one else got to see, I'm not going to be able to really say if a coffin was definitively reused, because the outside is what they want everyone to see, and where the most careful cover up is going to happen. So I think I'm going to avoid that coffin, even though it's the most beautiful in our aesthetic, in our understanding of what a gorgeous coffin should be, with all the bright colors and all the different texts and all of these things and your name on it. The coffin that shows your real power is and you see it in the early 22nd dynasty, where people are like, I don't want to be like those thieves. The polychrome, busy, horror vacui coffin becomes synonymous with coffin reuse. So much so that by the 22nd dynasty, the very rich were like, I want my cedar to show and shine bright. And so, and they maybe reuse cedar probably was in a lot of cases. Somebody needs to go and C14 all these things. Nobody's done that yet.
Mm.
But it's still showing that you have access to that clean wood with all of its grain. So I, knowing what I know, would probably choose a nice clean cedar piece with a name carved into it without too much polychromy, maybe some inlay in the central text panel.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got to be defensive, you know. The 22nd dynasty, they also knew that if you were a family member and you were going to take something from the family sepulcher and you didn't want the other family members to know, that you would take from the innermost coffin. Because if you go into a family sepulcher, you're not going to start opening up the outer coffins. You're going to look at the outer coffin and be like, oh, the gilded face is still there. It's fine. But it's an interesting thing that if you look at the 21st dynasty coffins from the royal cache, like Masaharta, for example, or Mat Kara, the outer coffin shows the nice gilded face intact. And the inner coffin and the mummy board, it's gone. It's ripped away because somebody came in and they're like, well, I don't want anyone to know that I'm stealing. So I'm going to take it and I'm going to put the outer coffin lid right back on and no one's going to even know. So they take those inner pieces. And by the 22nd dynasty, like, we're done with this. We know what they're trying to do. So they created this cartonnage container, which is a papier-mâché kind of creation, right? You're using papyrus and fabric and you plaster it and you fit it to the body and you tie it onto the body. Can't really be reused. You might gild it. It might have a gilded face, or massive parts of it on the lid could be gilded. And then, so it's something you would have to tie on and off. So somebody could still take the gilding and you're like, well, I don't want anyone to do that. So you pour on it all of this thick black resin, and that resinous black material. And this is something that Margaret Serpico has worked on with, what's the other woman's name? But anyway, look for Margaret Serpico's work. And it's made of bitumen, imported petroleum products. It's made of tree resins that have been cooked down. It's made of beeswax and oils. And you pour that right onto the gilding. And it creates this surface where you can't even get the gilding off. It's so stuck tight. And so no one gets access to your gilding. And I guarantee you that this is where the Coakite started to begin, you know, this idea of a professionalized burial guy. And the professionalized burial guy is like, oh, I know I have the most access to your stuff. I know I'm going to be the one coming back and doing all of the rituals because you're paying me to do it. But let me just show you that I'm not going to steal anything. So in front of your eyes, I'm going to pour the black goo, the black substance all over the gilding so that you know that I won't be able to get in there. And I'm going to pour it all over it so that if I tried to open up the container to get any amulets from the body, it would show all this black sicky stuff. If you went into your sepulcher, you would know. So that kind of highly defensive burial, I guess, would be the way to maintain some sort of integrity of burial long term. So if that's what I'm trying to go for, I would go for a high elite 22nd dynasty burial. Of course, it didn't work in the long run, but you know, we can do the best that we can.
Sure. Okay. Now my final question, and it's purposefully open-ended, but I'm going to try and tighten it up as much as I can from what I've written. Looking at the royal caches specifically, the ones for the kings, if you could go back in time to observe it and answer one single unresolved question regarding one of these coffins or the caches in general, if you could go back and say with definitive certainty, this is the answer to that question, what would you like to know?
I want to know how they were displaying the coffins of Amunhotep I, Thutmose I, Thutmose III. Were they, it doesn't seem, I can't say this outright. Like if I were a Peruvian expert, I could talk about huacas, I could talk about bodies of the dead being used as cult statues in a way, objects of reverence. I could talk about them being held aloft in festivals and being paraded through spaces. I cannot do that for these Egyptian coffins because they're not preserving that amount of information. But the amount of manipulation of the coffins and the bodies of Amunhotep I, Thutmose I, whose coffin is reused, Thutmose III, Ramesses II, indicates that they were used as idols. They were used as repositories of divine manifestation, and that they were displayed as such. And I would love to know where that happened and how that happened. Did they bring them to Karnak? Did they cross the river in beautiful Feast of the Valley? Did they connect with them in some way that was highly innovative and not and unexpected for us? And it's something that I can hint at in my work, but I can't really say it. People get mad enough at me for being a speculative historian, right? Already. So, you know, in this book, my most academic of books in the last decade, I can't then go and say that, yes, the body of Thutmose III is carried aloft like the Ark of the Covenant, you know, I can't. But I wonder, because the priests were using these bodies and manipulating and remanipulating and remanipulating. It worked. Whatever they were doing, it got everyone to do what they needed. It got them power, religious power. And and I'm not saying that the Thebans were simple-minded people, but for people to, I mean, look at the United States of America and how politicians use ideological power to get people to do what's not in their best interest. It happens all the time. And I would love to know how these bodies were manipulated and displayed, and to whom, to manufacture power amongst believers in this system, and then how that actually turned back against them. So much so that the 22nd dynasty guys are like, I know you guys pull these people out, these ancestor kings in your festivals. We're not doing that. We're shutting them away. You don't get them anymore. And the only reason we have this cash preserved is because, in a way, it's like a punishment. It's like they were put away so that they were too powerful. It's like, put the nuclear weapons away, cap them, seal them. We can't have them anymore. They were weapons of the mind that were so powerful that they had to be deactivated. And the final chiseling of the coffin of Thutmose III is like a kind of deactivation of that weapon of the mind. So I can't prove any of this, but damn, I would love to scurry in my little time machine and know how that happened. Yeah.
Intercontinental ballistic mummies is a mental image I now have.
It works for me. The Egyptians always put more money into their ideology than they did into their weaponry advancement. Not a lot of innovations there, except what they took from others. But wow, their ideological weaponry was very effective.
Well, as you were explaining, the example that immediately came to mind was the display of Lenin.
Of Lenin, the body. And if you go...
I wouldn't be surprised if there's some similarity, parallel there.
Yeah, and if you go to Vietnam, there you can see the body of Ho Chi Minh displayed in the same way and divinized, even in a place where they say God doesn't exist. In both places, in exactly the same way. That is your idol.
That's humanity for you.
Yeah.
And I think
it works.
I think that's fundamentally in my experience, having seen the criticisms that sometimes get thrown at your discussions, it often seems to be people who are reacting against the idea that the ancient Egyptians were human and that they did things that we might approve of and might not approve of. And people don't seem to want to see the ancient Egyptians as human. They want to see them as divine or special.
Yeah. Which is
logically,
it's a problem of its own kind.
With their own figures.
But we want to fetishize them and put them in their own little particularist basket, and then you can only talk about them in that way. And it's from my perspective, it's a huge problem. And the speculative history allows us to pull the Egyptians into our political and ideological spaces unlike anything else. And I'll keep doing it, and they'll keep criticizing me, and that's okay. That's what academia and writing and historical research is about. So I'd rather make some enemies along the way than play the safe game.
Sure. Scholarship isn't going to be advanced by everyone just sitting in the same comfortable boxes.
No, absolutely not.
Excellent. Well, Professor Cooney, that brings me to the end of my questions. So thank you for a very robust and detailed discussion of what is obviously a massive, massive topic. I mean, the book is 500 pages long, and at least half of that is just the photo essays. It's a
Yeah.
huge topic, and I'm sure you would admit even a book like this really only can scratch the surface of everything that can be discussed with these.
This is exactly why I published it the way that I did, because yes, I'm looking at reuse, but there are 980 photos in there for a whole lot of people to take and work with all kinds of other research questions that I haven't even thought of. So go off and do something with this material. It's there for everyone to use, and yeah, I hope more research questions come of it.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for taking the time out of your Hawaiian sojourn to speak with us. And
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
for those interested, I will obviously put links to the new book, your website, and all that in the episode description. The book comes out in August, was the last publication date that AUC gave me. After that, what does the future hold in terms of research or writing? Is there anything you're working on right now that you can talk about?
Yeah, I just signed a contract with National Geographic to do a book on Nefertiti, which, ooh, that's touching a third rail and stepping into a, a reign that is not in a time period, the Amarna period, which is not really my thing. So I shall do so with great respect and carefully, but it's gonna take some time for me to get this one right. And Nefertiti, I mean, it's gonna be as much a history of Akhenaten as anything else, right? Because what can one say? But that's really exciting. And I'm working on the second volume of Recycling for Death with Kylie Thompson, so that will take years. I don't know when it shall see the light of day, but we have started working on that and laying out. Choosing the photos is really the first thing. Choosing the coffins, then choosing the photos, starting the layout. AUC Press grants me the ability to write to the InDesign page, because you can't really work on these pieces unless you can see them visually, how they're laid out, which makes the writing process that much more fussy, but it allows me to work visually as well as anything else. And then for those of you that want to hear me opine like you do, Dominic, you can listen to Afterlives Now. That's that's the Substack. You can listen to Afterlives of Ancient Egypt, and that's available wherever podcasts are available: Spotify, Apple Music, all of those places. You can go to my website. And then finally, I have a Substack that we put out weekly when we can, with all kinds of links and other things, and that's called Ancient Now. And but if you put in my name, put in Kara Cooney, and you'll find connections to all of these. But the Substack has been really fun, and many of you have noticed that as politics have gotten more fiercely competitive, I have pulled away from Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, though I repost things on Twitter, but I refuse to call it the other thing. But it's harder to have discussions on those platforms because the algorithm doesn't allow anybody to see it, and what's the point? So I put all of my musings in those arenas into Substack, and I put more writing into Substack, and it's getting my attention now. And so the podcast and our blog are all in that one place on the Substack page, and we're pretty regular. It's me, Amber Myers-Wells, Jordan Galzinski, my co-host for the podcast, and we try to keep it pretty active and always have new things coming out. And I couldn't do it alone. So you can head on over there if you want to get any more of this brain. Yeah.
Very good. And I'll put links to all of those in the descriptions. So
thank you.
Kara, thank you very much. At just under 2 hours, we have not
Good
beaten
job.
our episode record, but we came close.
That was like 2.5, right?
Something like that, yeah. It was, you
Yeah.
had a lot to say about Hatch episode, understandably, and it was excellent.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
It was fun. Thank you.
And I hope, I guess, best wishes for the current projects. Do let me know whenever anything like that is nearing completion, because obviously there is so much more we can talk about, and it's always a pleasure to have you on. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a lovely day.
You too. Thanks. Bye-bye.